Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Centric. This being a show where we talk about TV shows and crime dramas. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about The Old Man Season 2, Episode 5. A great episode. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. Well, first and foremost, we open up, and it is this funeral process that they're having for Hamzad, and Emily's voiceover on everything, and it's really interesting perspective. Obviously, she's kind of viewing everything of right the time her and Hamzad had, where it's like obviously for so much of her life it's been a lie, not knowing the truth, and now having your entire world turned upside down, just for it to be turned upside down even more because your biological father, you got to know him but not a lot, and then did he get to really finally know you? He finally was able to bring you home, and there's just so much complicated stuff stacked on top of each other, and just kind of like Hamzad. I thought it was kind of beautiful because it's like Hamzad, Emily, and her mom are all kind of these incomplete puzzles that it's just kind of like we're all kind of going through the dark trying to figure stuff out, you know? And it's like, I even love that final line where she was like, if you meet mom again, do cut her some slack, because just like us, I think she was trying, like she was trying to figure things out too, and she was trying her best. So forgive her. And it's like, I'm sure he's come to terms with a lot of stuff related to her, like, you know, I don't know, they're just it's a complicated thing, and there's so many complicated feelings and circumstances all associated with it. It's a complicated family situation all around, and just kind of having to come to terms with that under these circumstances. And it's just like, you know, she'd even talked about like hearing people whisper about who he was and their loyalty to him, but it's almost kind of like, not that it falls on deaf ears, but it was just kind of like this conversation about how like it was almost just like how those whispers kind of disappear when they get to you, because it's like you can hear what someone meant to someone else, but it's like, what did you mean to me? And you know, I want to say goodbye to you in my own way, in comparison to all these other people who you meant something to. What you represented to them is kind of different from what you represent to me, and me wanting to kind of honor you and do right by you by doing what she did, by popping Omar, but also trying to stay behind and take care of this place. In fact, she sends the little boy off. It's Farouk, right? Sends him off with Tariq. They kind of, you know, and I even love the whole conversation with Khadija, which shout out to the person who corrected my horrendous pronunciation of her name, but it was just like, what did you tell him? And it's like, well, I told him that Tariq loves you and he's going to look after you, but also you're going to be lonely and you're going to be scared, and just kind of saying all this stuff. You know, she's like, kids deserve to know the truth, because in case we ever meet him again, you want to be able to look him in the eyes. And it's just like, you know, taking her experience of having her entire life be a lie, you know. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting conversation between the two of them. But things obviously don't, you know, they don't have long before stuff starts popping off in the distance. So we cut back to everything stateside, where we catch up with Cheryl, who's, you know, obviously excited to have Harold back, but Harold's kind of like, yeah, there's a lot going on here. So I was like, well, he probably knows about the Morgan of it all by now, obviously. I didn't know if he'd already gotten the note, but it's like, yeah, like Zoe and Dan were already here with him. So I was like, okay, so they already know. Well, I mean, he already knows. So Cheryl's still kind of left in the dark. And that ends up being this complicated conundrum of just, Harold has always tried to church and state, the separation. He's always trying to keep that at home, where it's like that work-life balance of work stops the moment I get home. I always want to keep work away from you guys, but that becomes less and less possible. And it's like, you thought for so long that you had upheld that, but it's always been this like bubbling thing, because it's like the moment you let Angela into your life, you know, because even later on, Cheryl even comments on like, yeah, we didn't even realize until later on, like we had built up these walls and expectations about how things were. Cheryl was like, I went into this knowing that we made that deal a long time ago. I accepted it. I knew what came with it, but kind of brought up Henry. It's like our grandchild did not like set up for that, you know, so it's like, he's going to look around for answers, and we don't want to be in a position where we have to lie to him and not give him the answers he wants. Because Cheryl's like, I get it. I'm not blaming you. I'm not trying to put you in a bad position, because I knew what this was from the get-go. I've accepted that. Henry didn't, you know? And it's just like, right, like, especially after the whole situation with Angela and kind of everything that's kind of going down with in Afghanistan with Hamzat, like, I think that's also why Harold kind of backed down a little bit, which I love him being like, well, Curtis and Lois are assholes, and it's like, yes, to us, but not to Henry, never to Henry. You know, that's also his grandparents, so they're gonna take care of him. He just needs to be away for a little while because he wants to be able to look to people who can give him answers. And if honestly he stayed here with us, he'd have so many questions we would not be able to give him answers, and that would not be right, and that wouldn't be fair. And once again, we see what happened to Angela growing up, so it's that interesting parallel of like getting that conversation after that conversation about, you know, Emily telling Frederick, like, you know, trying to tell him the truth and not lying to him. But getting back to the point I was making, it's like they had built up this wall of like separating, you know, work and home, but it's like it wasn't until after the fact of years later they kind of like, oh, we did not realize, or at least Cheryl was like, we didn't realize that we had made an exception with Emily, that we hadn't really even recognized that it was making an exception, like bringing her into our lives. You know, it's not like Harold knew at the, well, that's the question of like, you know, what Harold knew when, but also Cheryl's kind of like, you know, now getting filled in on everything. She never wanted to ask questions, but it was always like, she's even saying like, right, I asked you, were you coming home? Like, could we definitively see you again? And you couldn't give me an answer, regardless of what it is. She's like, I'm not trying to chastise you. It is just the reality of the situation. So Cheryl actually gets filled in because Harold's like, all right, I'm going to tell you the truth, because she's like finally meeting Dan. She's like, I met Angela's dad for the first time in the decade we've known her, and you're telling me I can't even know his name. It's better for everyone, you know, if I don't know everyone's name, you know. And just, I love the whole look her and Zoe kind of give each other. Zoe kind of looks at her, kind of nods, and she kind of looks at Zoe and kind of nods. It's like, yeah, because that, I'm all over the place, but I love that conversation. Are you an insider or are you an outsider? So either you're an insider who is trying to spare my feelings because you don't want to like tell me what's going on, or you're an outsider and they just haven't told you what you are, that you are one. And I love Emily, Zoe's answer of, I'm in a transitional period phase. And it's like, yeah, she went from an outsider to an insider, especially considering she was hanging around the most insider himself, that being like Morgan Boat, which, I mean, Morgan was more insight than like Dan and Harold were to some extent. So Zoe kind of like took a step in a direction I don't think Dan or Harold necessarily, you know, like I said, I don't, like, he didn't let her in on everything, but she was the person that probably got closer to him in a way than Dan or Harold, because there's too much history and baggage there. So speaking of Morgan, because Pavlovich talked about this at the end of last episode of like, oh yeah, like what's the world going to be like without the old man, without Morgan around anymore? And even Dan's kind of picking up from that of like, yeah, like, is it just about, it can't just be about Hamzad's like mineral deposit. It can't be, because it's like, you not only killed Morgan, you killed him on U.S. soil, and the blowback for taking out someone like him on domestic soil like that, it's like that's too great of a risk to take just for this. Like, yes, the lithium is important, but it's like, yeah, Morgan knew something that he shouldn't have, and Pavlovich needed him to go. So, which is interesting, because Morgan seemed like to be the guy that's like, I know everyone's secrets. So it's like, I guess it kind of benefits other people, like the man who held so many secrets in play. Like, once again, that's a power vacuum waiting to be filled, maybe. I mean, there probably can never be another Morgan Boat. I don't know if he set anyone else to be like that, like who steps in. Like, he had to have someone in place to like eventually replace him, because you weren't going to be around forever. But then the question is like, well, you know, did he have someone set up that, in what capacity? Like it seemed like the man that was holding so many spinning plates at the same time, and it's just, you know, it's like the domino effect of like, you don't know what like his death sets off potentially, you know. So we'll see whether they'll get into like the the massive consequences and the real, like, the ripple effects of his death having. I mean, we're going to see it in the confines of this story in the show, but I'm sure, like, there are probably outer layers to, like, the confines of, like, what this story is. There might be outer layers that maybe you would assume would, like, ripple out and then contract back in and kind of affect the story, but who knows? They were finally able to get in contact with Emily, and she talks about everything that's going on. She fills them in on Hamzat's death. It's like, well, you got to get out of there. She's like, well, I can't. They've already arrived. There's people like our army of people is trying to block them, but it's only 20 people. So we're trying to figure out what to do. And it's like, oh, go through the tunnels, because he's trying to be like, all right, how many people were you able to evacuate? Some. Okay, how many people are left? It's like families are left, or their children, and it's like, yes. So go through the tunnels, but Dan's like, and then they made sure to mute the conversation, because it's like, what do we do? Like, she can't, like, going through the tunnels is one thing if she's able to, because they have to see if that's a viable option, but also, it's like, they've also got children with them. It's like, Emily's definitely not just going to up and run, and even if she could, like, she wouldn't do that with, like, children still in danger and stuff. So what do? And this conversation ends up happening both from Dan, but also from Cheryl about their son Chip. I love the whole conversation about, like, Dan talking about the fact is when he's like, oh, I thought Emily was with Abby. Abby thought Emily was me. And it wasn't long. She was so young. She got lost. She wandered off, but she couldn't have gotten far. We found her. But he's like, that feeling. He's like, I've been through terrible things. Been through wars and stuff like that, but nothing else replicates that feeling. And he's like, it was like Abby smiling at him and laughing at him, because for her, it was like in that moment that she realized what it was, that it took him that moment to finally realize, oh, what Emily means to you. That it's like, oh, in this moment, you have finally realized that maybe you were kind of just going through the paces of it, of like, I'm looking after her because of the whole Abby of it all, but it's also like, no, I love this little girl, and she's my daughter, and I love her with all my heart. So it's kind of like almost like she can't help but smile, because it's almost like you finally kind of realize it. It's always been there, but maybe your brain and your heart weren't connected. Your heart felt it, your brain now finally caught up. I think it's kind of like my interpretation of that. But also apparently, like, Chip would always kind of wander off on his own to a friend's house or something, and which I kind of understand to some extent, because my parents would constantly be in that situation, like, where the hell is Michael? And it's like, yeah, I went over to my grandmother's house without telling anybody, like, all the time when I was younger. So it's kind of that same energy, and you're like, yeah, why don't you just put a bell around his neck or something like that? Just he'd always kind of wander off on his own type of thing. I thought that was cute. But Emily believing like this is the end. It's like, I want to talk to everybody. She talks to Harold and Cheryl. She's like, I'm sorry, you're going to have to go through this, kid. I did not ever plan or mean to put you through this. And it's like, yeah, they've been through this loss before. But she tells Harold, like, do not blame yourself. Like, the fact of the matter is that I don't blame you for doing what you did. And then, which I love that line coming back for Cheryl, where she's like, the last words I will ever hear from someone I knew for like a decade, it was like a daughter to me. Like, the fact is, I will never, like, those are going to be my last words with her, and I may never fully understand what those words mean. And it's like, that is kind of a sad thing of, like, it meant something to Harold. It means to us as the audience, knowing what you're talking about in correlation and relationship to everything. But at Cheryl, from an outsider perspective, it is kind of like sucky that so much of that was an insider conversation that she will never be fully privy to. Even when Harold telling her everything, it's still like, I will never fully know and understand the full weight of those words. I might have an inkling, I have an idea because of what I've been informed about, but I will never know the true weight of those words like Harold would. So that's kind of a layer of sadness to that. But yeah, she talks to her dad, and she's like, I want you to know, like, I stayed here of my own choice. This is my family, but I am not disowning you or mom. Like, you guys are, I still love you. And it's like, I want you have to accept this. Don't kind of drown in the sorrows of what could have been or what you should have done differently. Like, kind of don't let this consume you. And then the phone eventually disconnects after, like, shots are firing. So is Emily dead? I don't think so. Just because it's like, right, it happened off screen. To be fair, Dan was so sure in episode 1 that Emily was dead. Harold kept the faith to like, no, she's still alive. Now they're both being like, no, she's gone. But it's like, I don't think so. Because the question then becomes like, would Pavlovich, like, granted, does he know who Emily is? Like, either something happened at the last minute because they talk about it later on, but as I talked about at the end of last episode when Morgan got killed, it's like he was on his phone, so he sent something out last minute. So the question is, who got it? That's still a big question, and would that have anything to do with what's happening with Emily? So maybe someone swooped in at the last second, was able to help. Who knows? Pavlovich, could he have captured Emily, but why would he? Like, did he keep certain people alive because he needed them for whatever leverage he's trying to get? Or are they all dead? I would just assume like there'd be no killing Emily off screen. If you're going to do what you're going to do it on screen. But I just, even as an audience member, you can believe that and think that. But what matters at the heart of the story is you can be like, no, she's alive. But what's important is that the characters themselves believe her to be dead. Like Dan's kind of accepted, like, you know, just like, no, like she's gone. Like and so he went downstairs and fixed the water. I wondered, I guess he did that. At first I was thinking he did that just to distract himself. But I think it's also because it's like, no, I'm going to do what I'm about to do. So I need this place to like the water not to keep pouring. I need it to be like, I don't know. It could have been like, oh, I'm here just to keep my mind distracted. And then later on was like, but I can also use this for something. Maybe that's what it was. But, you know, him just being like, yeah, I could have done something. I could have stopped it. And him just like breaking down in Zoe's arms until like the lights came back on, which all seemed like not fortuitous, but just kind of like a sign of like lights coming back on, Harold coming downstairs. And it's just kind of like, all right, it's time to get answers. I need answers right here, right now. So I'm like, how are you going to get those? And so they go to the trunk. It's like, oh yeah, like it's like, oh, we're going to unload something that's in the trunk. Zoe, I need you to distract my wife. And it's like, okay. And then like they go outside and then you see Dan just like hitting something in the trunk. I'm like, oh, one of Pavlovich's guys is still alive. He never died. Like one is definitely dead, but you captured one still alive. So he's been in trunk the entire time. It's like, oh, we're about to torture this guy. Which I thought was interesting because Harold comes from the perspective of, I've been through this before. I know what to do. But then Dan's like, not this. He's like, I need to do this alone. So I think Harold's, I don't know if tortured someone, but he's probably interrogated people. So he's like, this is what I do. This is what I'm good at. Whereas like Dan's like, no, I will break him and get the information we need. Because it's like, there's no guarantee he knows anything. It's like, yeah, but we might as well check. And also Dan's in a mood of like, I need to hurt something. I need to hurt somebody, especially you're like connected to Pavlovich. So I need any answers right now. So I'm going to get them regardless. I also love this thing that this series does, I think, so well with that whole like, when they are like, and we see it the most with Dan. This is the first time we've seen it with Harold, I believe, where it's like, oh, usually it's, you know, whether it was like Abby in season 1 and like in like episode 1 it was Hamzad, like a younger version of Hamzad, but it's like it's someone like kind of in the background out of focus, like being like this ghost that's kind of acting as your conscience talking to you. In this particular case, it's their son Chip talking to Harold. And I thought that was so well done, especially because he's not lit at all. He's just such a shadowy figure in the background and out of focus because the focus is all on Harold. I think that was so beautifully done. All the stuff that it's like, you know, it's interesting that like Chip was kind of bringing up these points of, right, you wanted to separate work and stuff and you thought you were doing that, but there's also a little element of resentment of having to, you know, do that for our sake. And it's just for Harold, it's like there's so much he wishes he could have said. Those goodbyes. He never got to say one to Chip. He didn't have one really with Angela. And he didn't even really get one with Henry. It's just like, just after everything, all the effort I put in, you think it'd at least be okay. Just to, you know, it'd be kind of my payment for all the effort and just the trouble I've always kind of put into and making sure everything worked out. That all that effort bore fruit in the form of at least being able to say goodbye. Because I love that conversation of Angela, which even Chip's like, why are you calling her that? Like, didn't you just tell mom she was a fiction? He's like, I get it. Every fiction you've ever created over these years, it's coming unraveled all at once. It's like that is kind of a heavy thing to kind of deal with. But those last words made him go, last words. He goes to Zoe and it's like, okay, so what? Did Morgan say anything? It's like, no, he was on his phone. So it's like, okay, maybe he sent something to somebody. Who? And it's like, well, we don't know. So that's what I'm like, once again, as I brought up before, is that something in connection with Emily's circumstances, or is that something completely unrelated? Who knows? But it's like, who would be someone that Morgan would trust? It wouldn't be Harold or Dan, and I don't think it'd be something that he'd send to Zoe, but it could be like he sent something to Zoe and them not, like her not being aware, but I'd assume it's going to be some other party that maybe we're aware of that we're just not thinking about right now, or it's going to be a party we know nothing about. Maybe Harold and Dan know about, but maybe we as the audience obviously shouldn't know about. But then finally, Dan comes up from his pumping the guy for information, and it turns out, like, right, he's just a hired gun, hired by a guy. But it wasn't just Morgan he was after. It was also Zoe, but also Dan. Specifically, I think it was supposed to be like the identities they used when they met Pavlovich, like last season. So I was like, why? It's like, well, whatever we discovered then is what Pavlovich wants us dead for, because we discovered something we shouldn't know, and it could be used against him. And they're thinking of going to see Hamzat's lawyer, which I thought was interesting, because my assumption was like, oh, is this kind of implying like it was a setup? But it's like, no, now that's why she was scared to be on the phone, because I thought like Pavlovich had gotten to her in some shape or form, but it's like, no, it seems like she's still in play. It's just a matter of, oh, like, she was probably trying to avoid him just because she knew she might get caught up in the crossfire. So we'll see. Like, they've decided they'll go to London to get some answers about this, which, because I even love Zoe being like, fuck him, I want him to pay, don't you? And Dan's kind of like, yeah. So I even love Harold be like, all right, honey, Cheryl, I'm gonna put you in a hotel just for a couple of days. Those two are probably going to ask you to look after their fucking dogs, but that's up to you. But it's like, he's like, because for her, it's like, I know I don't, because for Cheryl's perspective, it's like, I know I don't have the big picture, but she's like, I'm understanding things a little more and more, but she's like, when it comes to you, I am understanding you less and less, because it is this situation of, you thought, even from an outside perspective, you thought you had an idea of who Harold was, and now you're seeing like, no, there's more to you, and I kind of knew there would be, but it's making me question even the bits about you I did know, bringing them into question. So, and even then, like, you know, it's like, when it's all said and done and I get back, can we try to figure out where we go from here, like, to make this all work? And she's like, I will try. And it's like, that's all you can hope for in this situation. So, but it's like, yeah, you go on ahead with them. I gotta, like, lock up and take care of some things. I was like, is that guy downstairs still alive? I'd assume he wouldn't be. But then, like, Harold went downstairs. He was kind of roll up and sleep. I'm like, are you going to go down there and finish the guy off? But then, like, I didn't think they'd actually show you, but, like, you do see in the water reflection Harold pick up something, like, what is that? And when he kind of walks back, like, towards the direction of the camera, you see, like, oh, it's a saw. It's like, oh, you're going to cut up the body. Cool. So that guy's definitely dead. So there's no way Dan was going to leave that situation torturing him and not kill him. But because the saw, not unless you're going to do it while he's alive, I'd assume it's afterwards. Like, you just got to dispose of the body, got to handle this really quickly. So, which is kind of morbid. Well, it's already a morbid conversation, but, like, I thought was interesting, because even Zoe had asked, like, what happens to Morgan's body? It's like, well, leaving it there, like, eventually someone's going to come in, like one of his secretaries or something, or assistants will come in and find his body, and things will kind of be handled from there. So, I mean, really, it's like, what can you do? It's like, because it's like, we don't want to be anywhere nearby when his body's discovered, just because of the amount of heat and attention it'll draw. So very, very interesting developments all around. I'm excited to see where the next episode takes us with all of this. There's only 3 episodes left this season, so it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. Find out what Pavlovich like, what it is that Dan and Zoe knows that they need to die. What did Morgan send out and to who? Is Emily still alive? So many different questions. But really, that's all I wanted to talk about. To the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.